clearly there is frustration, understandably, at the Council's inability to address some of the fundamental peace and security issues which are confronting the world today.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020.
Figuring out how to navigate this tension between a more crowded institutional landscape and the actual standing institutions we have is incredibly important.
Today, adapting the United Nations for modern global challenges.
So the challenge is really, how do you incorporate all of these other voices?
We've seen these huge oscillations in terms of where U.S. political culture takes us. And
in the past, the United States could be a rule maker or a rule shaper all by itself. Today, it cannot.
Hello and welcome everyone to today's discussion about the role of the UN in the dynamic of today's world, which I think has been described sometimes as fragmented, sometimes as a return to great power competition, and also awash in multilateral initiatives. So, today might be a crash course in international affairs. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I am the president of Network 2020. As background, Network 2020 is a nonprofit organization. We're based in New York City, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We run a lot of programs, a lot of webinars like these. We also have in-person discussions for people in New York. We have virtual salons. So we have a range of ways that people who are curious, individuals who want to learn more about what's happening in the world, can engage with experts like the ones that we have today. Today's discussion comes at a time when the desire for leadership and accountability, I think, is really strong. There are tens and hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets really demanding a ceasefire to Israel's unrelenting campaign against Hamas after Hamas's horrific attacks on October 7th. The UN General Assembly and many agencies are among those calling for a ceasefire. And yet, at the same time, just this morning, NPR released a poll showing that more Americans, including a majority under the age of 45, believe that the United States should be focusing on its own domestic issues rather than playing a leadership role in the world stage. So on the one hand, we have calls for leadership. We have an international body that is trying to provide some sort of leadership. And we have a country that is a global leader that is losing its appetite for leadership, which in my mind makes for today's discussion to be a very important one. So what is the role of the UN going forward in the dynamic of today's world? So with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome back to Network 2020 both Stewart Patrick and WPS Sidhu. Stewart is senior fellow, yes, we're on that right slide, and director of the Global Order and Institutions program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Professor Sidhu is clinical professor and director of the United Nations Specialization program at the Center for Global Affairs and at New York University. So welcome back to both of you. It's a pleasure to have you here. Starting with you, Sidhu. These days, as I mentioned, the UN is making news for some of what it is also not doing rather than what it is. We talked in our prep call last week, I think, about the failure of the UN Security Council, and I want to make a difference between the Security Council and the General Assembly, their failure to agree on a resolution regarding the Israel-Hamas war. So could you just give us an overview of the current concerns regarding the efficacy of the Security Council and then the UN more broadly? And just to ensure that we are all on the same page, it would really help if you could just start us off by helping us understand really, like, what is that purpose of the Security Council in light of what we're seeing? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and it's a pleasure and a delight to be back again on a Network 2020 event, and also be here with my friend and colleague, Stewart Patrick. Very much looking forward to this excellent dialogue here as well. So, clearly there is frustration, understandably, at the Council's, inability to address some of the, fundamental peace and security issues which are confronting the world today. But it's also worth noting that some of these issues actually date back to right to the start of the United Nations. So, for example, the Israel-Palestine issue dates back to 1947. The Kashmir issue dates back to about the same time, 1947, 48. And Korea also dates back to 1950. So these have remained intractable issues for a very long time. There were others that went along, but the UN has been quite successful in resolving some other issues. But these obviously are the most difficult issues that the UN has sort of faced with. And this brings me to your second and really more important question as to what exactly was the purpose of the UN Security Council in particular. And I think there were two objectives of the founders in creating the UN Security Council and the veto. The first, and probably the primary objective of the Council, is to prevent great power conflict, which today really translates into conflict between the present 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And this is why the veto was enshrined in the Charter, because it very much kind of underlines the ability of these permanent members to exercise that when they feel that their vital interests are in some ways impacted. The second objective of the Council was to prevent conflict anywhere and everywhere if possible. But here there is a little bit of a Faustian bargain or a compromise, and that was only going to be possible if there was consensus among the 5 permanent members on trying to address that other conflicts there as well. So very often, what has happened, ironically, is that the second, more loftier and indeed noble objective, one might argue, has very often been sacrificed on the altar of the Council in the first to achieve the first objective. And that really is the world that we're living with, and that is the implications which we're confronted with today.
Right. Thank you for that. Stewart, turning over to you and kind of broadening the lens a little bit, you have written of late about minilateralism and competition with the UN. So what has contributed to this trend of minilateralism, and what are the implications of what seems to be, perhaps a proliferation at best and maybe even a fracturing at worst of the world?
Thanks, Courtney. Absolutely. One of the hallmarks of contemporary international relations is this explosion of competing multilateral frameworks. Some of these are flexible, informal coalitions and arrangements, but they tend to be outside the United Nations and other treaty-bound organizations. And a lot of them have to do with some of the frustrations that Sidhu began to talk about. The UN's not the only game in town, and it's not an entirely new phenomenon, but you've seen it as increasingly palpable. For instance, when you think about the UN General Assembly, where Joe Biden was in fact the only member, only leader of a permanent 5-country to actually attend, raising questions about sort of the UN's place in this more complicated environment. But that UN General Assembly opened on the heels of the BRICS summit, which that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and which invited 6 new members, and there are dozens more waiting their wings. Meanwhile, the United States has kind of been doubling down on a lot of its Western frameworks and creating even new frameworks, such as the Quad, that in some sense might compete with the United Nations. And there's the G20 summit as well, which occurred right before the UN General Assembly. So you have a situation in which is a crowded multilateral landscape. Some of these institutions could conceivably be competing with or as sort of apex institutions with the UN, and particularly with the UN Security Council. Now, this proliferation of multilateral institutions is happening, for a bunch of different reasons. One of them is that geopolitical competition and strategic rivalry have taken off. You've got a resurgence of East-West tensions that are reminiscent in some ways of the Cold War. So it has an echoes of division into the world's division into 2 camps, right? So in the same way that you had a one world vision right before the start of the Cold War, then you suddenly got a three-world vision. And so within the broader UN framework, you have this coalition of like-minded advanced democracies, et cetera. But I think when you have, in a sense, sort of in a more modest way, an equivalent on the authoritarian power side, Russia and China. But today's fissures aren't just happening east-west; they're also happening north-south. And so you have greater assertiveness amongst the countries of the global, quote-unquote, global South, which is, it's a problematic term, but there's no question that many developing countries who are members of the G77 and, weren't even many of them countries when the United Nations was created and the Bretton Woods institutions were created, they were colonies, excuse me. They are increasingly dissatisfied with international institutions that they feel like don't reflect their values or interests. And so you see this fragmentation going on. And I think that there's particular fury directed at the UN Security Council because the five permanent, basically the composition of the Security Council has not changed since 1945, except for the addition of 4 elected members in the mid-1960s. So you have the same 5 powers, and there's a growing sense of fury, I think, that the permanent 5 are either abusing their power, as in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, totally unprovoked and totally contrary to the UN Charter. And then there's a sense that in other cases, for instance, the United States with respect to Gaza, there is quite a bit of fury around the world that with the perception the United States is protecting Israel by virtue of its veto. So you have this huge change in which there are many different institutions. And sometimes there are positive things that go along with that, right? You can these ad hoc coalitions, you can break down pieces of the problems of the global agenda into smaller pieces. You can be flexible. You don't have to wait for these large lumbering institutions to go on. But this can come at some cost, however, because it can lead to global fragmentation and no common rules of the road. So figuring out how to navigate this tension between a more crowded institutional landscape and the actual standing institutions we have is incredibly important.
Great. Thank you. And I think we'll return to some of those good crumbs that you dropped a little bit later. But Sidhu, turning back to you, in your recent book, The Future of Global Affairs, Managing Discontinuity, Disruption, and Destruction, you explored agency beyond the nation state, really focusing on the role of coalitions, alliances, and international organizations. So, with that in mind, how do you imagine the future of global affairs, which is in a much more fluid and often confusing environment, as Stewart just alluded to, where the rules are being rewritten on a regular basis? And then how does that square with what we've talked about a little bit earlier as well, that this moment is also in a way a return to the idea of great power politics?
Mm-hmm. And those are the key drivers and sort of challenges that we're facing even today as we look at discontinuity, disruption, and destruction. And some of these terms may sound more negative, but in fact they're really talking about fundamental change. So in some ways, discontinuity was the difference in doing business from the past, some of which can actually be more efficient and more effective. Similarly, discontinuity or disruption could be new ways of, again, doing business or engaging, which can, again, be far more constructive as well. And destruction could also be something like, maybe sort of moving from moribund organizations, institutions to relatively new ones. And as Stewart Patrick was saying, we're really in a moment of churning where a lot of these issues are developing. Now, already you can see a lot of this happening within the UN realm. So the UN, as we all know, even though its preamble, the first 3 words of its preamble say "we the people," is really about we the states. And the states have for the longest time sort of held on to the notion that, look, they are the only representatives and the only spokespersons for everyone kind of in their sphere. But turns out that there are now other increasing actors, more equally significant actors at the sub-state level, individuals, as well as alliances and other organizations that you talk to, who also play an equally, if not more important role in some of these areas. So the challenge really for the moment is really how do you incorporate all of these other voices? And this is where you're starting to see a little bit more of the tension and, the inability in some ways of the UN to accommodate this, or it is accommodating it, but very grudgingly. Just going back to a quick point that Stewart made, and I want to link it to what I'm about to say. The UN fundamentally plays sort of three roles: one of arena, second as that of an agent for the member states, and third as an independent actor. Its role as an arena now was really only meant for member states. So it really needs to now open that space up for other actors. And some of these are sovereignty-free actors. They include the private sector. And it leads to this one word, which is in fact anathema to a lot of the UN members, which is multi-stakeholderism. Now, the Secretary General has tried in his eloquence to try and get around that by saying, well, actually, what we're talking about is networked multilateralism. But it is very, very clear that today, if we're to move towards a new order, and the future of global affairs definitely demands that, it is no longer only going to be member states or states which are going to determine that order. We've already seen the very significant role that tech companies, for example, have played, as well as companies which are now shooting for Mars and the stars, literally, are going to play, as well as individuals like Greta Thunberg, but also other NGOs, civil societies. Cities are another important actor that we need to recognize as well. So you've really got sort of two sets of tensions and challenges here. One of them is one that you very rightly pointed out, the great power competition. Now, when the UN was created in 1945, people tend to forget there was in fact an uber superpower, a sole superpower, and that was the United States. It was the only country with nuclear weapons and really kind of dominated the world between 1945 and 1949. But it chose to build, with compromises, of course, the UN. Today, it's a very different world. The United States is certainly not the only power in the world, and while it still retains a military power, power has diffused. We are now talking increasingly about multipolarity, and even though all the poles may not be of equal power, we will need to have a compromise and a discussion between them. Stewart writes about this, and I'm going to cite him a little bit. In the past, the United States could be a rule maker or a rule shaper all by itself. Today, it cannot. Today, it needs to work with, number one, other countries, including the rising powers and the other poles, to shape the rules of the future. So that's the first. But second, member states alone are not going to be enough. We also need to have these new actors that we've been talking about: civil society, private sector, cities, regions, along in that conversation as well. And so it is really a moment of churning, a moment of opportunity, but huge challenges as well.
Very well put. If the UN itself, with all its member states, has a hard time, I can imagine once they open it up. But one question, you mentioned begrudgingly was a word that stuck out there in terms of opening up. Is it begrudging on the part of the UN itself as an institution, or is it with the member states? I'd love just to dig in a little bit more about what's behind that.
I would probably say that, it's, I think the Secretariat is perhaps the least reluctant in some ways of opening it up to some extent, of the different actors that you can think of, one being the member states and the other being the international civil servants in the Secretariat. I mean, they're not entirely comfortable, but they're probably the least uncomfortable. And then I think when you look at the member states, you really get a whole divergence. And here, again, I will evoke what Stewart said about the division between the East and the West, and to some extent also the North and the South. I think some countries, again, are relatively more comfortable with the presence of other actors who are not state or sub-state actors or individuals, etc. But then there are some more traditional countries, shall we say, and many of them happen to be countries which were actually in the past colonized by some of these mega conglomerates. Think about the East India Company, for example. And so there's an inherent aversion to kind of, at least the role of the private sector, even though all of the member states have kind of acknowledged in their acceptance of the Sustainable Development Goals that these goals can only be achieved with the inclusion and participation of all actors, including the private sector, cities, regions, and individuals as well. So there is a tension there, and again, that's something that the member states will have to contend with.
Great, thank you for that clarification.
Here at Global Insights, we're on a mission to bring you the most profound analysis and meaningful insights that matter. But we can't do it alone. As a nonprofit, we rely on your support to ensure we can continue providing you with the kind of content you depend on. If you value thoughtful analysis, meaningful insights, and content that makes a difference, visit network2020.org to learn how you can make an impact. Thank you for being part of the Global Insights community.
Stewart, so turning back to you, how is the UN's position shifting in this world of competing multilateral blocs and bodies? How are they adapting? And then sort of a second piece to that is, what is the United States doing in all of this? How do you see them fitting into this picture with the approach to UN and multilateralism?
Sure. Beginning with the United Nations, it's definitely struggling to find its way in a world in which nations increasingly have fundamental disagreements over basically the contours of world order, to say nothing of the privileges and place that they actually occupy within that order. I think one important thing just to say at the outset is that it's really important to remember that the health and performance of what we call the UN is essentially a function of the behavior of its member states. So particularly those that are most important. So the deepening crisis of the UN is partly an issue of UN reform, but in many respects, it's an underlying crisis of multilateralism, in which countries have turned their backs on some of the basic principles of the UN Charter and are behaving irresponsibly in many cases. So unfortunately, it's very easy for the UN, in a sense, to become a scapegoat for the behavior of its member states, which bears on US domestic politics for sure, since it doesn't really have necessarily a natural constituency, which we can get to. With respect to the fissures that are running through international society right now in the multilateral system. I wrote a Carnegie paper recently on which I called Rules of Order: Assessing the State of Global Governance. And the overwhelming message of that was that the fissures today are problematic, not just because they're not just about distribution of material benefits or distribution of power, but they're basically disputes over the vision of world order, as well as the content of these principles, norms, and rules that are supposed to govern state conduct in all manner of spheres of international affairs. So if you look at issue area after issue area, from fundamental norms like the use of force or not to non-proliferation, to state obligations on global health security and how, what should they be forced to do during pandemics, for instance, or what are the responsibilities with respect to climate change. How should the terms of global economic interdependence be renegotiated? Or how should we regulate, artificial intelligence or the global commons like the oceans or outer space? All of these things, in all of these areas, you see incredible normative contestation about what those obligations should be. And so this clashes has really complicated the role of the UN, which has been established as the first port of call for international cooperation. And as I mentioned, it increasingly shares space with a lot of different entities, including multi-stakeholder frameworks, as Sidhu mentioned. Now, turning to the United States and multilateralism, I wrote another paper earlier this year. It was basically looking at 4 contending U.S. approaches to multilateralism, and which you could find in different aspects of the Biden administration's approach. I mean, the good news from my perspective is that the Biden administration is relatively internationalist compared to its quite hyper-nationalist predecessor, but there still are a lot of choices that you can make within that broad framework of we'd like to engage globally and how do we cooperate. And I call these the 4 C's. And the ones that we're talking about today, or at least as a port of departure, is kind of the charter conception, right? The UN is the first port of call. It's a universal body. And we use it and other encompassing treaty-based organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, for instance. And it has a major virtue because it has legitimacy, right? Everybody signed up. It has legally binding authority, right? The second, though, which has come more into the fore with the onset of sort of a Cold War 2.0, is what I call the club approach, and that is basically let's create a circle of our advanced market democracies as our allies. And so that's the logic there, kind of a league of democracies. And you've heard this kind of language in Biden's Summit for Democracy language. The third approach, and I should say that the benefit of that is about solidarity, right? You're with your buddies, right? The third approach really focuses on capability, and that is really sort of an old school concert of powers approach. Now, this is obviously in abeyance, but it's still held out as a vision. If Russia could come in from the cold, could we get some fundamental agreement on just basic rules of peaceful coexistence amongst the great powers? And then the fourth one is the coalition approach, and that's the one that sort of favors flexibility. And we've seen a lot of that in U.S. Policy. In fact, I guess I think it was Anthony Blinken said that we're in favor of diplomatic variable geometry. He called it. It allows us to assemble coalitions that are truly fit for purpose. And you've seen this in a variety of different things that the administration is doing. The challenge in all of these things is to try to balance how these different approaches relate to one another. And all of them have certain limitations as an approach to world order and international cooperation. So figuring out how to rely on the sort of flexible multilateralism that doesn't undermine the big institutions that are treaty-based that you need and that have standing technical capability is a huge challenge. And you actually, what's interesting is, I'll finish on this. I'll say that what's good, as I said, is that the administration is broadly committed to internationalism. If not always placing the UN front and center. The bad news from the perspective of the United States, which has always had an ambivalent and highly selective attitude towards the United Nations for a number of reasons, partly because it has such outsized power, but also partly because it has a sovereigntist political tradition, and there are constitutional issues there with respect to its relationship to the UN compared to what other countries face. All of that could change on a dime next November, depending on what the outcome of the presidential election is. So we've seen these huge oscillations in terms of where U.S. political culture takes us. And, when you talk to international interlocutors, and that's one of the things they're most worried about is just, can we have some sense of confidence which way the United States is going?
Thank you. I wish we had a crystal ball, or maybe not. I don't know. Sidhu, we've alluded to some of the major challenges that the world is facing today, from pandemics to climate change, new technology. What approaches or innovations do you think are necessary to really help enhance the UN's efforts and make them more effective? If we're talking about bringing in all of these stakeholders, how can that happen in a way where change and positive change can happen?
Right. It's an excellent question to ponder over, and I'm not sure we have enough time to do that, but I'll take a stab at that. So what we've been discussing about until now very much are kind of the old problems, which have not gone away. I began by saying there are some issues which date back to the time of the creation of the UN, which are still very much on the agenda of the Council and the UN, and still remain to be, resolved in that sense as well. But while we're doing that, there are a whole range of new challenges, but also opportunities which have lent themselves, which frankly did not exist when the UN was created in 1945. So look at the revolution in technology, right from artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, there's a nanotechnology, space technologies. I mean, there's a whole range of things that were simply not addressed or we were not even aware of in 1945. So now the question is, and we've already seen the debate in universities and others about ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence abilities. So there's very much an effort, I think, on the part of the UN to try and perhaps stay ahead of the curve. To the extent possible, while also trying to bring on board as many of the stakeholders who have a role in this brave new world. And so one of the things, which I really do have to commend this Secretary General, is to move towards something called the Summit of the Future, which is going to be held next September. And while, it is obviously very aspirational, and given the time that this Secretary General has, may not be as operational, I think there are key elements in that we need to look at, which are very, very promising. So, for example, the UN has recently established the Office of the Tech Envoy, whose objective very much is to look at these emerging technologies. And obviously, there are two elements of these technologies, right? So one is, if you like, the benign ones, and the other ones are the more militaristic, confrontational ones. And the UN, I think, is going to focus more on the first ones, to see if we can't sort of have a common level playing field, so that everybody has access to the positive, constructive parts that these technologies offer, particularly in terms of sustainable development goals. So the Summit of the Future is really a sum of these different ideas coming through. One of the very important ones is what is called the Global Digital Compact. This kind of understanding as to what the world needs to agree upon, so that we can all benefit to the extent, as far as possible, equitably, in the benefits of the digital revolution, which is frankly just about to take off as well. So there are, at least in terms of norm creation, ideas creation, the UN is trying very hard. In the next year, I think is going to be very, very crucial to look forward in that. And again, to the credit of the UN, they have, at least on the Global Digital Compact, reached out to these other actors. They've reached out to the private sector, they've reached out to civil society, and obviously the governments are there already. But how this is going to play out, what is going to be the conclusion of that, still remains to be seen. Incidentally, it's not very well popularized, but the UN has also created, in my opinion, I think, quite a remarkable artificial intelligence high-level panel, or a high-level panel on artificial intelligence. It's truly global, and brings in very, very different perspectives, who are really going to sort of advise the UN on how to go forward. And that panel is really a multi-stakeholder panel. It includes everybody in that sort of a sense. And of course, I haven't even talked about pandemics and climate change, but again, we do have the setup, the establishments there. And frankly, there, I think you can see the UN playing a crucial role, because nowhere else can you see the climate change conversations going on. We're likely to see one in less than a month in Dubai. And that format is going to remain. Now, of course, it's up to the member states how they want to move that forward. But frankly, again, even there, the fundamentals have been sorted. We just now need to get the financing, politics, and the technology right.
Yes, yeah, very, very, very good point. I think, especially bringing in the financing. Stewart, I just wanted to turn to you as well. Given the challenges that WPS just spoke of, given this the Summit on the Future, where do you see effective governance coming from? And then also just tying it back to what you said in one of your first questions, how do you keep some of the states that might be feeling frustrated and want maybe more of a seat at the table or in writing the rules of the road. How do you keep them involved? Is this Summit on the Future? Is that a place for them? How does that momentum stay within the UN?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really loved Sidhu's last comments in particular. And I think the Summit for the Future is a really interesting opportunity. Now, it's a very ambitious vision, much like the last major reform effort, which took place when Kofi Annan was Secretary General in 2005. The Secretary General Guterres is going back to calling, he's part of it is a new agenda for peace, which echoes also a previous reform effort under Boutros Boutros-Ghali 3 decades ago. It's highly ambitious, everything from outer space cooperation to issues of artificial intelligence and the digital world that we live in, reform of global financial architecture, et cetera. I think the one thing that we need to be aware of, or at least a little bit cautious about, is just the scope and sweep of what the Secretary General is trying to accomplish. He has a bully pulpit. He has a lot of political capital, but some of those decisions, for instance, the future of the international financial institutions, will probably be taken elsewhere than necessarily New York. But he can provide some very important catalytic force, and I think it's important to try to steer this in the most productive direction possible. I think that I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Sidhu said, in a sense, not at the intergovernmental level, but at sort of more complicated aspects of global governance, and then turn to what can be done. There's no question we've seen a sort of an eruption both in multi-stakeholderism and also what I would call multi-level governance. And you see this, it's obvious, particularly in the case of technology on the multi-stakeholder aspect of things, where you have, the role of ICANN within cyberspace, and then emerging AI governance, like the commission that the Secretary General just put together. Future of biotechnology and biosecurity obviously has a role for the private sector and for civil society, as does hugely climate change and in the health space. So, in the health space, you see Gavi, the Global Fund, CEPI, all these different acronyms, basically, where the private sector and foundations are playing just an enormous role. And in climate change, you see the same thing with, task forces and agreements on financial disclosure of exposure to climate risks that major institutional investors are doing. So, for any of the fortunes of getting these problems solved, you definitely need these actors. You've also got multi-level governance. My colleague Ian Klaus, who directs Carnegie California, he's doing great work on cities as well as other subnational entities and their role as global problem solvers. There are some dilemmas, as sort of Sidhu indicated. It's hardly a silver bullet. It does raise some questions of representation, legitimacy, accountability in a world that's still based on sovereign states. And obviously, some of the more sort of paranoid of those sovereign states, often authoritarian governments, are not very happy with the role of civil society, the private sector, being part of the driving force here. But there are also issues of global representation. Let me just mention a couple other things about the UN. One trend that has been interesting with respect to Ukraine, to some degree with respect to Gaza, is the growing assertiveness of the UN General Assembly because of the inability of the Security Council to be reformed, or let's just say its paralysis. And so you've seen some historic resolutions basically saying that it's almost in the uniting for peace tradition that were that emerged during the Korean War, when the Security Council is blocked. Some of the action on peace and security, although in a limited way, moves to the General Assembly. A couple of principles, I think, that need to be there are a number of things that could be done to sort of bring the rest of the world along and also rescue multilateralism. One of them is there needs to be some rededicated to basic principles of peaceful coexistence, hopefully beginning with China and the United States. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the president and Xi Jinping come up with today. I've long called for what I imagine could be an Atlantic Charter for Pacific Century. We need some principles of coexistence and cooperation. And great powers also need to learn to compartmentalize. One of the tragedies of U.S. China diplomacy recently has been the insistence by the Chinese on linking cooperation on climate change with sort of more tractable U.S. positions on the future of security in East Asia. And that's like putting a gun to your head and saying, I'm going to shoot myself, or threatening to burn down your house your own house because one of your family members is not doing the dishes with you. It's pretty ridiculous. And then finally, I think the United States needs itself to make way for others, both in pushing for institutional reforms and allowing others to have a greater say in the world, and also to allow others to step up and take a leadership role when it makes sense. I think we have this knee-jerk reaction that it has to be about us, and I think that that needs to change. Always has to be about us in the leadership role. I think as the world becomes more multipolar, as Sidhu mentioned, there need to be other cooks in the kitchen, I guess I would say.
Thank you. We have a question here, and I'd love to pose it to both of you because I think it's a very good one. So I'll start with you, Sidhu. And the questioner asks, can you speculate on the most likely types of unexpected events and or more bold strategic prompts by any nation beyond the current plotting pace that could precipitate a marked sense of urgency about UN reform? In other words, what types of events, forces, or strategies might speed up a reform process fit for the 21st century at this precarious moment?
Sadly, it's not so unexpected, which is my concern and worry. And I think there are two that I can immediately think of. One, almost very immediate, is the danger of nuclear war. And it's something, that we simply cannot, dismiss. And certainly, Ukraine has brought that very much to the front in two ways. One is, the danger of nuclear war itself, but also what it means for other countries now looking at what's happening to Ukraine and then maybe aspiring to get nuclear weapons as well. And nuclear war, as we know and scholars have written about it, can actually break out in three different ways. One, deliberately. Second, through accidents. And gosh knows, we've had a lot of accidents ever since these weapons were first, created in 1945. But the third can also be unintended consequences or misunderstanding, miscalculation, and that always happens. That there's always a chance of that if there are nuclear weapons involved and you get the signaling wrong. And there's a real danger of that in Ukraine, but not just in that part of the world, in other parts of the world as well. That I would say is probably the more immediate and perhaps clear and present danger. Now, one could argue that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, was in some ways a weapon attack. It obviously wasn't, a weapon in that sense, but as the UN Secretary General said, this is how it could have unfolded. I'm a little, pessimistic of how poorly the international community responded to that. And that does not at all augur well for a similar kind of catastrophic, attack with another pandemic, perhaps, or even nuclear weapons. The second, of course, is climate change. And again, I'm perturbed and surprised because I thought by now we've seen increasingly or enough extreme climate-related events for us to take the step forward and take the most obvious kind of responses that we need to do to alleviate this and carry out the reforms that have been talked about. But clearly, that too has not sort of happened as well. So these, I think, are on the very kind of negative side of the side of things as well. On the positive side, I think to the questioner, if there was a coming together of the permanent members of the Council again to reform, and particularly not just the Security Council, but others as well, we can see this move forward very, very rapidly. We've seen that historically when there was an agreement between the US and the Soviet Union to admit, People's Republic of China in place of the Republic of China into the Security Council and the enlargement. It happened very, very quickly. Similarly, there was almost no discussion, when at the end of the Cold War, it was also decided by consensus among the P5 that Russia would be the successor to the Soviet Union in the Security Council. It wasn't necessarily a given, but that was also kind of agreed to very, very quickly. So I think if there's that kind of consensus, then you might also see a breakthrough.
Thank you. And just as a note, we had Rose Gottemoeller, the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, on about a month or so ago. And she said, with the nuclear scenario, that inadvertent signaling misfire like that the missignaling is a real concern. So Stewart, you're over to you for your.
Yeah, really quickly. I would share many of the scenarios or potential scenarios that Sidhu mentioned, and I think that exacerbated by the unknown consequences and even unknown capabilities of artificial intelligence and how those play into issues of everything from stability in outer space to stability of nuclear weapons to the possibility of, because the technology is conceivably so distributed, the acceleration of manufacture of bioweapons, either by non-state actors or by states themselves. I mean, historically, it is true that it's not a guarantee of effective change. Obviously, the COVID pandemic suggested that was the case. That it, notwithstanding a lot of proposals, that it didn't get to the sort of effective multilateralism that one might have assumed. But normally, I mean, historically, crises, a leadership that's willing to actually exercise leadership, and then, of course, some new ideas about the way of organizing the world. I think that other crises that are really important, other than the ones that Sidhu mentioned. One of them would be a dramatic escalation of crises in the Western Pacific that leads to an actual shooting war, an extensive shooting war between the United States and China. I think might be sufficiently terrifying. And conceivably sufficiently destructive to get people to come to their senses about the need to cooperate at a multilateral level. But many of the other ones, including climate change, I mean, a dramatic, people have been talking about tipping points, and there are certain tipping points that we are very, very close to, whether it's a collapse of the Amazon rainforest, a shutdown in the Atlantic meridional current, which keeps Northern Europe temperate. There are a number of different things that one could imagine as being sufficient shocks. But again, like Sidhu, I'm kind of amazed that we seem to be still frogs in the pot boiling and not jumping out.
If anything, I hope it's Sidhu's more optimistic scenario of the P5 members suddenly decide that it's time. Because the other scenarios do not sound like ones that we want to get into. But at any rate, thank you both for the thinking that you're doing on these issues, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Just my brief announcements, housekeeping. It is that season. It's that time of year when we give thanks, and we give thanks for programs like these. We are a nonprofit. If you can donate, please do. This allows us to keep these programs free and reaching people in over 100 countries around the world. So thank you for donating and supporting Network 2020. Stewart, Sidhu, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It was a great hour. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
It's listeners like you who make Global Insights so special. To stay connected, deepen your insights, and join our community, visit network2020.org.